ABC News presents At Ease with Howard K. Smith and Harry Reasoner and ABC's foreign and domestic correspondents.
I suppose the clue to what we're doing that's different from a normal news program was the title that they had at the beginning of this broadcast, which said The Wide World of Entertainment. We don't normally think of ourselves in the news business as entertaining, but we did the first ABC News at Ease about a year ago, and we have been horsing around with it 3 times since. This is the 4th appearance. They said ABC's foreign and domestic correspondents. We have some very foreign correspondents, and we have some very domestic correspondents, and they're all here. And the theory is that it is interesting to look at reporters when they are not being absolutely serious and not doing a minute-and-a-half report or an hour documentary. That's what we're going to try to do tonight, with the help of my colleague, Howard K. Smith.
We don't intend to cover the events of 1973, just to graze some of the highlights and tell some of the stories that may not have been told. We're going to talk with 6 ABC News correspondents from widely separated parts of the world, with Washington, D.C. probably the most widely separated part of the world. Here's some of the things we'll see.
We'll see Ted Koppel in a tug of war with the People's Liberation Army of China. And there'll be Steve Bell out in the fields pounding millet with the Chinese peasants. We'll examine the change in the President of the United States in the last 12 months. And walk across the Suez Canal with one of the first correspondents to follow the Israeli army into Egypt. We'll see what dangers correspondents are willing to endure in the line of duty. And Jules Bergman will wax nostalgic about spaceflight and show us some of the rockets that did not work.
Our first 2 correspondents tonight are here for a particular reason. They are Ted Koppel, who is normally at the State Department, and Steve Bell, who is normally chief of our Hong Kong bureau. But actually, we haven't seen much of either of them for the past 6 months because at some point in August, they disappeared together into China, ostensibly on company business. There was some film sent back, which indicated news stories, but and some of it was actually usable, as I remember it. But while it is not any longer all that distinguished to have gone to China, it is still fairly unusual to have gone as a pair with a film crew for that long. And they did turn up a number of facts about the People's Republic, which we hadn't known before. Ted Koppel had been there before with me in the presidential trip in 1972. And I suppose the obvious question, Ted, is was there any difference between the state visit and your news covering visit?
Not only between the state visit and our visit, but it seemed as though China had loosened up a great deal, period. I think we'll see some film a little later on in this program that shows just how loose things got, and they got fairly loose. In many respects, though, China is still a very formal nation, and there's kind of a thread that runs through no matter where you go, and perhaps the thing that best shows that thread is the kind of greeting that you would get everywhere you went. And I mean everywhere. It would be in a factory, on a commune, it would be way out in the countryside. You would arrive, you would be taken into a room, there would be tea waiting, there would be cigarettes waiting, and then the leading member of that group would get up and he would give a little speech. And invariably, no matter where you were, that speech went, warm welcome to our American friends. Yesterday you were in Peking, today you are in Shenyang. You have had a very long trip. You must be very tired. Your work is very intense. But first, a brief history of our textile factory commune, and then they would go on and they would give you 45 minutes of brief history of that factory, and then the question would be, and now what do you want to do? Although it would usually be put, wouldn't it, Steve, in terms of what are your demands? And it took us about 4 weeks to get the interpreters to change that from demands to requests.
Well, that was almost part of the formalism that went on, too. They would say, what are your demands? And we would say, oh, we have no demands, but we do have some requests. And then you would go into the second part of the ritual. But we decided after a very few days that we simply couldn't take 7 weeks of this unremitting formalism. So we began to try and joke with our interpreters and the others in the group. And not formal jokes, but American-type humor where you're kind of digging the other person. And we began kidding them about these formal little statements that would be made. And all you had to do was change the date and the place, and everyone would suffice for the other. And so we began mimicking these, and our interpreters got with it. And pretty soon they were mimicking them, and then when we would get to the next town and have to go through it again, they could hardly do it without breaking up.
Well, the interpreters have gotten looser then.
The interpreters got a great deal looser. And in fact, one of the things the Chinese try to do, and as you say, it's not that distinguished a thing to go to China anymore because more and more people are going. But they have a way of wanting to let every visitor who comes to China feel that he is doing something that no one has ever done before. And we were up in Shanxi province, and they took us to a tiny little village, and they said, no foreigner has ever been to this village. Even during the Japanese occupation, when the Japanese had this whole area, no Japanese ever came to this village. We arrive up there in our little minibus, we get out, and there's a little old lady standing there with her cane, toothless, and she starts grinning as soon as she sees me. And she comes hobbling over, and she clasps my hand and shakes it and says something to me, and I turn to the interpreter, and he says, I said, what did she say? She says, welcome back to Anshan. No, it wasn't Anshan, it was...
There's a theory that there's only 1,000 Chinese that are allowed to see.
And they
from the West, and they move them around.
You know, Harry, this really is not true, and this was the surprising part of the trip. There definitely were places we were not allowed to go, but where we were allowed to go, a particular commune, a particular factory, you could walk up to anyone and ask to speak with that person, and there was no problem whatsoever. In fact, the place where the little old lady welcomed us back, Menshang Brigade, Production Brigade, we had asked for a very remote area, a poor area, even by Chinese communal standards, to do the barefoot doctor story. These paramedics who are used to help bring medical services to the most remote areas. And that's why we were at this particular place, and we were allowed to talk with anyone. And certainly reporters hadn't been there in droves before.
This was 30 miles from Peking, I understand.
No, it was a little bit more.
It says here something about millet flogging.
Well, that was the doctors. That was the doctors out. You know, the whole point is that the doctors not only work as doctors, but when they're not treating someone's ails and illnesses, they're out participating in productive labor. And these two guys were out there flogging millet. I don't know if anyone's seen anybody flog millet before, but you get there with these big... Well, they looked so inept at this that Steve and I thought anyone can do that. We can do a better job of it than they're doing. And I think we're going to be able to let our audience judge for themselves. I think the first one you'll see is Steve flogging the millet like crazy.
These films were shot in slow motion, I believe.
No. You're just looking at a very deliberate millet flogger.
This separates the grain from the chaff?
Right. There's a threshing floor at every production brigade, which is a subdivision of a commune.
Now, I want you to notice the change in style. Here's a really elegant millet flogger who just lost the end of his flogger.
I don't want to say anything pejorative, but I think that community would starve if it depended on the millet.
As a matter of fact, I think we set their production back about 2 weeks with that.
Well, you got out that far. Now, if you'll remember, Ted, in the pioneering visit that you and I and President Nixon made.
In that order.
In that order. We had the feeling, as a matter of fact, you discovered up at the Ming graves or somewhere that it was sort of a staged affair.
Oh, it was.
This time, did you do any of what you would call reporting? Were there fewer restrictions?
It was our biggest problem, Harry. The Chinese, first of all, are extremely, I mean, excessively polite people, as you know. And part of it is just politeness. And the other part was that everything was very much set up. There was one instance, we'll get into the PLA in just a second, there was one instance when we were up in a commune, and they had a whipping tree, where in the old days, before the new China took over, the peasants would be whipped by the landlord. And they told us that they brought the young people there to tell them about the bitter past. And I said, well, that would be a fascinating thing to film. You know, how often do you do that? And they said, oh, very often. I said, well, when's the next time you do it? I said, well, when would you like it to be? So it was that kind of thing.
Let me ask you about the origins of this trip. Was this not the result of some kind of treaty that ABC signed with Peking, the first treaty that Peking signed?
Indeed. The chairman of the board, Leonard Goldenson, and the head of ABC News, Elmer Lauer, went over to Peking, and they signed an agreement whereby we exchange. I don't know what we're getting in exchange.
It's not been approved yet by the Senate, though.
No.
And presumably we'll get visitors from China to come here and
I think we're going to be having some Chinese broadcasters who hopefully will be coming over here. In theory, this was supposed to be a cultural exchange, and it's some evidence of the paucity of culture at ABC. So two of us.
What kind of restrictions were placed on you? Could you name a place and then go there?
Well, the main problem you had was trying to get past the Dog and Pony Act. Every local committee would have something that they reserved for foreign visitors, foreign friends, and they would try to get you to see that at the exclusion of whatever else you wanted to do. And getting them to understand that we wanted ordinary people doing ordinary activities for a little better look at the people of China rather than the Great Wall or acupuncture was the big difficulty. And a couple of times, one time especially in Shenyang, we had to stay with this man, deal with this man who was the head of the Shenyang acrobatic troupe. And getting him to agree to take us anywhere but to spend 2 days with two crews to the Shenyang acrobatic troupe was difficult.
It was a real test of will.
Finally, we staged a sit-down strike. The buses rolled up and we were all supposed to go to the Shenyang acrobatic troupe. Well, we said, one crew's ready to go, the other crew is sick. And there we all stand. So,
and it worked, I must say.
At 11 o'clock the same morning, back they came and said, gee, you can go where you wanted to go. Well, gee, everybody's feeling better now.
We had the same thing with the PLA. The PLA, we got into a long discussion.
I think we should say PLA is People's Liberation Army. All the guys who look like Texaco dealers.
Those are the guys. Well, these guys insisted that the whole general staff would be out there watching. We were to go along on a little march with them, with a battalion. And I was pointing out to the one guy that there was just no way we could film things as they naturally were if you have the whole general staff of the division out there. And finally, it came to a complete showdown where they wouldn't leave and we wouldn't start filming. I told the cameraman, come on, let's go. And at this point, we were walking across the bridge in one direction, and the entire battalion was walking across the bridge in the other direction. We went back, again, a sit-down, and by that afternoon, things had progressed to the point where it was fun and games with the PLA. And what you're going to see now is a piece of film on a tug-of-war. It's a triangle. Two men will be standing at one end holding onto the rope and a third man at the third corner, and the object is to pull the other two back far enough so that you can grab a little red flag. Now you see Steve is just getting ready to start pulling. Behind him is a little red flag.
Than the military.
And they had to bring in two of their meese because Steve is a little bigger than the average Chinese.
In the first team. And for the second time around, you got Koppel, and when they saw Ted's size compared to mine, they moved in two smaller men of their own.
Now there again, the applause, no matter whether you win or lose in China, applause is the name of the game. Who was it? Grantland Rice would have been very much at home. And now, I must say there were three of these, and you see me winning here. I got clobbered in the next two. And there it is again, the applause, and we reached the point where we were applauding everybody too. They brainwashed us in no time whatsoever.
Now, you look like you were relatively euphoric. We had some doubts about what you were doing over there, and this film doesn't help all that much.
No.
You look pretty happy.
It was a very pleasant trip, and they really made every effort to be as friendly as they possibly could. As a matter of fact, at one point, when we first got to Shanghai, we had heard about a little Italian restaurant in Shanghai. And we tried to explain to them why we thought an American audience. We said, in America people go to a Chinese restaurant and it's kind of an interesting evening out. And so we wanted to go and film at this Italian restaurant showing a Chinese crowd at an Italian restaurant. And as I recall, my clothes had something to do with, it's kind of mind-boggling to be ordering baked Alaska. Now watch it, there's a waiter who's supposed to bring a plain baked Alaska. This is take 3. To me at this point. Now watch for the waiter to arrive. I'm not sure if you'll see him this time.
It's both delightful and reassuring to discover that veal piccata is as exotic in Shanghai as egg roll and snow peas are in Brooklyn. When you think that only a couple of years ago none of us would have dreamed of being here at all, then the thought of baked Alaska Well, it's, if you can't light it, I don't want it. When you consider that we have 93 people, a budget of $200,000 to do just this one spot. Somehow, it's both delightful and reassuring to discover that veal piccata is as exotic in Shanghai as egg roll and snow peas are in Brooklyn. When you think that a couple of years ago, none of us would have dreamed of being here at all.
Now, I must say, at that last point, what was happening, and Steve can give you more of a detail on it. No, forget it. What was happening is the waiter is desperately trying to light the baked Alaska. And we, at this point, off screen, have, 4 or 5 people?
There were at least 5 of us. We had a cigarette lighter with the flame going up this high. And this poor waiter is struggling to get the thing lit. It never would light, and he kept... Finally, he began coming on camera, and his hands were just going like
dominoes, you know.
Couldn't speak English.
And out of the corner of my eye, I see this frantic activity at all times, and you know, that's what happens to steakhouse.
Well, I think what we've clearly demonstrated is that while in the first pageantry trip with President Nixon, we merely looked at some of the tremendous pictorial values of China, this time you guys went back and dug for the real values.
That's right.
And that's the kind of thing that Americans appreciate from their journalists.
You get jellied swallows, and in an Italian restaurant in Peking, you get jellied swallows with spaghetti. Right.
And we'll go into considerable more of what Mr. Bell and Mr. Koppel learned last summer in just a moment.
Correspondents Steve Bell and Ted Koppel have just come back from about 6 months traveling the length and breadth of China.
It seemed like 6 months. It was only about 7 weeks.
On film, things seem to work. Does the system really work when you're able to watch it close?
Well, the system works for outsiders' eyes because of several very obvious things. For one, it is organized from the top to the bottom in a very precise and structured way so that the person at the bottom does get the message. You can't go to anyone in China. You can't talk to any peasant, any worker who doesn't know the right answer. And you get the right answer. And there is a constant, you don't see bayonets pointed at people. You don't get the feeling that bayonets are pointed at them or that they have that feeling. But what there is in China is a tremendous peer group pressure. It's almost like being at a church. We found a religious analogy there where somebody next to you might say, brother, we just don't think you're living quite right. And you're under peer group pressure to conform. This we found. And the thing where we saw it work through examples we knew and were told to us by Dr. Ma, an American who's been in China through all these years, were in the medical area. When they took over China, they had tremendous problems with all these diseases that are rampant over Asia, the typhoids and the other things that cause...
You had that in New Jersey last year.
Yeah, right. And over there, you wiped out millions. And China got rid of these things by very effective organization, politicizing the medical process. For instance, venereal disease was rampant when they took over China. How do you get rid of VD? Well, first, you organize block committees that go into every home, into every bar, every brothel. Women volunteers actually went and lived in some of the brothels to gain the friendship and trust of the girls there. And the message was not that you are stigmatized by having VD, but that you are a victim of the system. This is a bourgeois disease, and the only sin...
A lot of bourgeois
yes,
going around a lot.
The only sin is if you bring this bourgeois disease into socialism. So line up and get your shot. And everybody lines up, and there is no more VD to speak of statistically.
And they're tremendously harsh critics of one another and of themselves. We were with one of our guides, Mr. Lee. If anyone's seen the Shenyang acrobatic troupe, the Shanghai city also has an acrobatic troupe. We went to see them. And they're doing phenomenal things. There's a guy up there in a slack wire, and he's doing everything short of reciting a doctoral dissertation on that slack wire. And I turned to Mr. Lee, and I said at one point, there were 5,000 people in there, no one's applauding except us. I said, don't the Chinese applaud? He said, oh, yes, if it's good. I said, well, what's wrong with this guy? He's sensational. He said, too tense, meaning the guy looked too tense while he was doing all these things on the wire. Next act comes up. There are poles. Guys are climbing up the poles. They're standing on the pole, just holding one arm, and they're standing out on the pole. I said, how about these guys? And he said, well, not bad. It just wasn't all through. Finally, by the end of the evening, the last act drives the audience crazy. They are absolutely wild. They're applauding, they're whistling, they're stomping. They bring the guy back for 4 retakes, 4 encores. What did he do? Bird call imitation.
Well, you sound like you got along better with the people you had to live with, the daily interpreters and the drivers and so on this time than we did. They're really easier now. You could joke with them.
I think just after 7 weeks, these guys were the first to know it, Steve.
Well, they quickly got into the groove with us, and pretty soon they were prodding us with humor. In fact, Ted was the last to know that one of our interpreters, whom we called Field Marshal von Shin, he was about 90 pounds, soaking wet, and a very military bearing, was doing imitations of Ted behind Ted's back, as Ted would be doing the stand-uppers. And we have some film, which once we learned about it, Ted and he collaborated on film of Ted Koppel in China, thanks to Field Marshal von Shin.
Now, Shin, I must say, Shin had been doing this. I told him that I knew he'd been doing it, and I said, come on, we've got to do this on film. And to my great amazement, and I think it implies that his bosses...
There we go. All right. Go ahead. Welcome to Dao Chai for 5 days. We've got the impressions on the peasants here. This is Ted Koppel, ABC News, Dao Chai in Shanxi Province.
Take 3, stand up, close. We have come to Dajai for 5 days. We have deep impressions of the peasants here. This is Ted Koppel, ABC News. Excuse me, Steve, I just wanted to say the fact that they were willing to do it implied more to us. They simply would not have done it unless someone way up on top had said, go ahead, humor these crazy Americans, play along with them. No single interpreter who's fairly low level is willing to make that kind of radical decision on his own, especially if it means going on film and knowing, as he knew, that it would be shown on American television.
And of the 2 interpreters, Shen was by far the most correct, the one who talked in cliches. The English he had learned was in cliches. When we were leaving China...
That made him ideal to imitate Koppel.
As we were trying to leave, as we were getting on the train to leave China, Shen was trying very hard to say goodbye to us and really convey the fact that he thought we'd become friends. We felt it was a genuine moment, and he had obviously memorized his little speech. And it was, our friendship is like the blossoming of the cherry blossoms in Washington and Peking. Our friendship is like the confluence of the Yangtze and Mississippi rivers.
And he's holding Steve's hand with one hand and my hand, and the tears are in his eyes and the tears are in ours. We've got a piece of film coming up with Mr. Shing. I've got to do a little bit of background into this. Over the protests of Harry and Howard, we're going to replay the Great Wall song. As some of you may recall, that on the first trip out, we wrote a song called It's a Grand Old Wall. And I was determined to film it on the Great Wall, and the crew rebelled that day. They said, this is our one day off, and we're not going to do it. So I finally convinced one of the cameramen to let me borrow his gear, but we needed a sound man. We didn't have a sound man. So Mr. Shing, whom you just saw, acted as sound man. I don't know if you're going to be able to hear him or understand him, but he was playing the sound man in this. Are we almost up to the film? He was playing the sound man in this, and he would give us the takes and the cues when to go. Are we ready?
Yes. Testing.
Testing? Okay. Very good. Take, what take is this, Mr. Shin?
Mm-hmm.
What take? What take?
You.
All right.
Don't laugh this time.
Okay.
Because you very voice in the recording.
Okay, right. All right, Alfonso.
It's a grand old wall, it's a long-standing wall, wins the prize for its size and its age. It gave just rewards to the Mongol hordes, over the rocks away in a rage. From Peking to the sea, it has saved the Chinese till the days of the Kuomintang. on and on and on. With the Great Wall, you can't go wrong.
I think the moral is go to China without a president with you.
It's much more fun. Have we got the time for a quick postscript on that?
We have.
All right. There was a sound man with us, fantastic sound man by the name of Alfonso Berni, who is a very meticulous sound man and who insists on always doing things the right way. And if there was any background noise that he heard that wasn't visible on camera, he would do a cop-out on mic, and he would say, you know, maybe you can't see the trains on film, but there's a railroad nearby. Well, between two of the tapes that we did of that song, all of a sudden, Mr. Shing pulls the microphone back and says, "This is Alfonso Berni, ABC News on the Great Wall. If there is anything wrong with my sound, it is not the fault of the equipment, it is the wind. Take 3.
Well, thank you, Ted Koppel and Steve Bell. Thank you very much. We are going to turn next to the problems we've had this year in both Washington and the Middle East with Tom Jarrell and Bill Siemens, and we will get to that in just a moment.
We have with us now 2 ABC correspondents who work at places just about half the world apart from one another. ABC White House correspondent Tom Jarrell, who had the good sense to come from Louisiana, where so many fine reporters come from. And ABC correspondent Bill Siemens, who was a producer, but who had the good sense to become a correspondent in the Middle East. Bill, Tom's been reporting most of this year about Watergate. What did people in Israel think of Watergate?
Well, first, I want to say we're following a very tough act, Koppel and Bell. And if you could get them to Israel sometime to help me out, I'd be delighted. President Nixon is identified with all the nuts and bolts that the Israelis get. The equipment, the phantoms, the ammunition, the solid substance of running a war. And all the Israelis I've talked to just can't conceive in their mind that President Nixon might have done any wrongdoing in the Watergate affair. And they rationalize it in the most extreme ways. And I remember a conversation I had with an intellectual, a member of the faculty at Tel Aviv University. We talked about half an hour, and he said, at the end, "Bill, deep in my heart, I know that President Richard Phantom is innocent."
Tom, how has life changed this remarkable year? I remember it was just last April that Time magazine said, never has life seemed so beautiful to Richard Nixon. And in the very next issue, the cover said, Watergate blows up.
And now he's flying commercial to California. Certainly has been a sharp change in his entire lifestyle. Perhaps one of the sharpest changes has been, from my vantage point anyway, the press-president relationship. The adversary relationship has gone, I think, now to one which each side sees as a petty, vindictive relationship rather than a constructive adversary relationship. The president releases his income tax and financial information, and he expects to see headlines that say, President's financial information shows he is not a crook. And instead, the headlines read that the president paid a very small amount of taxes in 1 year. He contributed a very small amount to charity in 1 year. He deducted something like $1.89 in interest on a department store purchase on his income tax. He sees this as petty harassment by the press, and he is supposed to have told one aide, "What do they expect me to do, to stand and disrobe in front of them?" I think it shows the frustration that he feels. And that, in turn, is feeding back an antagonistic relationship, I think, from his standpoint. He travels now without taking the press pool, which has the responsibility
I want you to know that our hearts bleed for you when you have to take commercial aircraft.
And he travels without letting us know when he's going, which caused some personal inconvenience.
Do you think there'll ever be another televised news conference?
That's a hard question after the last one. Certainly, if he is to survive, I think sooner or later he has to go back and have televised news conferences. Out of those, he gains more than the reporters do. I've always felt that they are for his benefit.
If he keeps his cool.
Right. Last April, when the president was trying to be forthcoming on Watergate, he said at that time that the strong, free American press should be complimented for its role in Watergate, and that he hoped the press would continue to give him hell and that he could deserve their respect. Then in his last televised news conference, we all recall he said he could not dislike someone he did not respect, that he felt reporting was vicious and distorted, and I think this shows the sharp decline in the relationship between the president and the press.
How about the president himself? What's this done to him this year?
I think it has worn on him tremendously. Being close to him and seeing him quite frequently as we do, the aging is very definitely there, the tiresome effect of it. Of course, he had pneumonia, and that pulled him down during the year. Yeah. But he has lost so many of his top aides. He is trying to do their work. He has been bombarded time and time again with new hard developments, traumatic events over the course of the year. He is a loner, so much so that Barry Goldwater even recently remarked that he had never known a man who could be so alone in such a high office. His daughter, Julie, in a recent interview said Mr. Nixon was having trouble getting out of bed some mornings, and I think that's a stark reference to...
Well, I would hate to see that listed as a criterion of whether you can do your job or not.
I feel that way quite often, too.
It's not a contrast when this man was jumping out of bed before they would unlock the office door during his first term. I think it shows how...
Well, he used to brag when he was first going into office. I remember him talking in a televised interview about how it was quite possible to do breakfast in 5 minutes, lunch in 10, and he might horse around for an hour at dinner if it was an important guest. But he was very pleased with how long he could spend at the desk.
Well, we have a film, I think, that shows brief excerpts over a period of a year, and I think it shows very well the toll that the year has taken on the president.
Let us pledge together to make these next 4 years the best 4 years in America's history.
Obtaining an agreement which provides peace with honor in Vietnam. While I was in Florida trying to get a few days' rest after my visit to Moscow, I first learned we had brought the rate of inflation in the United States down to 3 4/10%. That gave us my constitutional responsibility to defend the integrity of this great office against both. I'll nominate and send to the Senate for confirmation the name of Dr. Henry Kissinger. Recognize the fact that the peace that we have worked so hard to build not only for ourselves but for all the world will go to the Mideast. And this force, however, will not include any forces from the major powers. States have half the world's known coal reserves. We have everything that I possibly can to provide the evidence that would have existed had we founded. I have appointed an energy emergency action group under my chief energy advisor,
which the nation lays upon the President of the United States.
The President, we might point out, has maintained some sense of humor through all this. At a recent dinner for President Ceausescu of Romania, he rose during the toast after the dinner, and he said, President Ceausescu, Mrs. Ceausescu, ladies and gentlemen, and those of you who will be listening to the tape. Perhaps a story in Washington that illustrates very well where we are as a nation is one that is circulating around now, and it goes something like this. The president slipped off one evening on his yacht Sequoia for a cruise on the Potomac, and he accidentally fell overboard. And a couple of young lads about 15 years old came by on a motorboat and pulled him from the muddy, swirling waters of the Potomac and rescued him. He called them forward later, and he said he thought they had saved his lives, and anything that he could give them, he would try to grant. And the first boy said, Mr. President, I'd like to go to West Point. And the president said, well, that can be arranged. I can take care of it. And the second young fellow said, Mr. President, I'd like to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. And the president said, well, aren't you awful young to be concerned about where you're going to be buried? And he said, no, sir, not after I get home and tell my father what I've done.
Tom, you talked about, and we showed signs of the strain that President Nixon has gone through. A friend of mine whose work I respect a lot, but whom I disagree with on this point, wrote the other day, William Shannon in the New York Times, that he thought it would be only a matter of weeks before Nixon would be removed from office. Do you, I know you don't like to predict on the eve of a new year, but what do you think of that?
It's something that people are asking, and I made a point before this program of asking 10 of my colleagues that cover the White House regularly, and they've covered many administrations, most of them. Out of the 10, 9 thought, and I put it on a basis of if you had to choose, do you think the president will serve out another year? 9 thought he would not make another year. 1 felt on a basis of 48 to 52% that he would survive and make another year. Again, reporters take a pessimistic viewpoint. Now, I think he's going to get some additional breathing room because of the energy crisis, and let me explain that if I may. This is the period when congressmen and senators have gone home to sample public opinion at the roots. Senator Scott said each man is a walking Gallup poll. I think had the energy crisis not come along, people would have been telling their congressmen and senators they wanted a move to get the president out of office, to impeach him sooner. I think now the energy crisis is going to be the #1 issue that's going to give him a little more breathing room, but I don't think with all of the trials yet to come up, with John Doerr and the Rodino Committee getting ready to go into impeachment sessions, and certainly with Jaworski and his investigative unit at work, next year looks extremely bleak for Mr. Nixon.
I was encouraged in a way, Tom, to hear you say that the president has kept something of a sense of humor through everything he's gone through. Have the reporters kept any sense of humor? They sometimes sound a little petulant. Do they ever laugh at themselves?
Reporters always are laughing at themselves, and often at work they've done. But one of the most interesting names to come along for reporters in a long time is this fellow William Simon, the new energy czar. Because you can have all sort of fun with that name when you're reporting and he is giving out directives. You can say, Simon says, turn down the thermostat. Simon says, slow down your automobile. And he recently took 1,500,000 barrels of jet fuel from the military and gave it to civilian aircraft. And there was a story that said Pentagon Simonized. He's a man who gave up supposedly a $2 million a year job to go to work for the government. So at his news conferences, he of course appears to be Simon Pure. And a man in this tough of a job, sooner or later is going to run into trouble, and I can see the headline now. It will say, Simple Simon underestimates energy shortage. But besides names you can have fun with, we also have names that you can have a great deal of trouble with. And my colleague at the White House, Yuri Landé, has an example which we've all encountered at one time or another, and that is in handling foreign names that are difficult.
President Zulfikar Ali Bhutto of Pakistan, the Shah and Empress of Iran, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam of Australia, Premier Tanaka. President Zulfikar Ali Bhutto of Pakistan, the Shah and Empress of Iran, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam of Australia, Premier Tanaka of Japan. They'll all be visiting the White House within the space of only 2 weeks, and in the next few days we expect a formal announcement on the date of Henry Kissinger's announcement, oh, President Zulfikar Ali Bhutto of Pakistan, the Shah and Empress of Iran, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam of Australia, Premier Tanaka of Japan. They'll all be visiting the White House in the space of only 2 weeks, and within the next few days, we expect a formal announcement. That was no good. President Zulfikar Ali Bhutto of Pakistan. No. You want to roll. Take 7, DEF.
Remarkable. I'm sure it's never happened to any of us. Bill Siemens, I'm not surprised that you say that President Nixon has very high prestige in Israel. I think most Americans think that America has always supplied Israel's arms ever since Israel was founded. In fact, the first war Israel fought against the Arabs was fought with mainly Czech arms, and the next 2 with mainly French. Actually, it's only recently that America's begun being the main supplier of Israel for arms. One of the things President Nixon did this year was to appoint a new Secretary of State who has many qualities that are remarkable. Among other things, he is the first Secretary of State with the same faith as the Israelis. Did they look upon that as a gain for them, as a disadvantage for them, or having no effect on them?
Strangely enough, it's a subject that's avoided as much as possible. I can't help but feel that the Israelis do think it's something in their favor, secretly, deep in their hearts. But the peripatetic Mr. Kissinger spending so much time in the Arab capital seems to balance off that pretty well. He travels so fast that it's, we have an old saying, here they come, there they go. And covering Kissinger in the Middle East is a sequence of coming out of doors, into cars, out of cars, into doors, out of cars. So,
we saw that a little when I visited you briefly for the quieter period of the last war, Phil, and let me thank you publicly for the cooperation you gave. It was a very hospitable war. It was the first commuters' TV war, wasn't it?
It was unique because Israel has a satellite, a ground satellite station, which was a tremendous propaganda advantage for them. The weight of stuff coming out of the Middle East seemed to be all Israeli, no matter how objective the reports were. This satellite station is near Jerusalem. The facility is near Tel Aviv. But what it meant for us was a real commuters' war, because we had to be back in Tel Aviv to feed that satellite at midnight every night. And what it meant was starting up from Tel Aviv at midnight, driving down to the Sinai, 8 hours, a few hours running around wherever we could get along the battlefront, breaking off at 2 o'clock in the afternoon for another 7-hour journey perhaps back, and just a couple of hours to prepare our material for the satellite. And we had to come back because, strangely enough, you're on the battlefront, but what you see is so limited. It's only within the scope of your vision and hearing, and you can't relate that to what else is going on elsewhere on the front. And our reporting teams got as far as they could go, and we had to go with escort officers, military escort officers, each team. And we got as far as the individual escort officer who was with us. Some were conservative, some had a lot of initiative. And there's one unnamed foreign reporting team who had a very conservative officer one day. They wanted to go this way and he wanted to go that way. Couldn't film this, couldn't film that. So finally, the correspondent called for a toilet stop in the middle of the desert. And unfortunately, the escort officer got out first. Doors slammed, cars screeched. He was left irrigating the desert as the team went off by itself to do it. Some of our fellows had strange experiences, and we have a film shows Barry Dunsmore, who thought there were phantoms overhead, Don Farmer being welcomed by Syrian artillery, and yours truly taking a walk in the sun. It's rolling, I hope.
The Israelis have continued their offensive in Syria.
Those are MiGs, and that's Akak.
It was also strafing and bombing uncomfortably close.
This is Don Farmer's team. He's in the back. They say there are no atheists in foxholes, and here there weren't even any foxholes. This is a lineup to the bridges across the canal. This is about a mile behind at the point they were walking across one of the Israeli bridges across the Suez Canal. There's another one to the left of me, no other one in sight in this sector. And the vehicles you see in front of me are part of the continuous stream that is pouring across the bridge on this day. The scene now is up at the Golan Heights, where I spoke to probably the coolest company commander in the Israeli army, who is refueling and re-ammunitioning his tank.
What's your tank company doing here?
Again, actually fighting at the we're fighting against the Arabs. You know, this is the Syrian line. And this company is fighting from Saturday, Yom Kippur.
You've been fighting since Saturday. What are you doing here now?
I will resting a while, get new arms, I think, and go back fighting. That's it.
So how much of the battle has your company seen here?
A great deal of battle. We are here, as I told you, from Yom Kippur.
From the first day?
We are one of the first regiment that was here in the front.
How did the Syrians fight?
Not bad, but not good enough.
My escort officer reminded me of what you said about how much you owe to your escort officer. And mine, if you remember, was a fairly high-ranking guy, and he was very helpful. But he said, quite obviously, he said, this is my 5th war here, and he obviously did not intend to get killed getting us a picture.
There was a moral to this film. That bridge scene, we had to leave our vehicles 1 mile before the bridge because the Egyptians were shelling the bridge area. So we had to walk about 1 mile through the desert sand and then 1 mile on the other side. Moral of the story is I may be getting too old for Sinai coverage. And
3 more wars, though.
The second moral is to get this film. One guy always stood up 1 or 2 minutes longer than everybody else, and that was the cameraman. And they really deserve a vote.
Don't play though, yes.
Tom, as Bill mentioned Henry Kissinger and his quick in and out travels, and one story that is true that they tell about Kissinger was after he came out of one of the Arab countries, he was walking hand in hand with one of the oil sheiks back to his aircraft, and reporters spotted him. When Kissinger got back on the plane, they said, Henry, don't you worry about your reputation if those pictures get back to the United States. And he said, I've been worried about my reputation since Brezhnev kissed me on the lips in Moscow.
In the middle of that crisis, I met him in one of the corridors at the White House, and I said, are you in trouble? He said, well, if I could choose, I would not have chose this to be my first crisis. Well, thank you very much, Tom Jarrell and Bill Siemens. We'll come back in just a moment for a talk with Charles Murphy, who is probably our most traveled correspondent, and Jules Bergman, our science editor, who has some thoughts about the missile age.
We're now at the point we're going to talk to Charles Murphy, who I suppose is the nearest of all reporters in this group to my own career, which could best be described, if it doesn't belong to somebody else, it's his. And to Jules Bergman, a bright and upcoming young man in the space program. When I hit Jules first, it's not generally realized that I am far more of a pioneer in the space program than either you, Jules, or upstarts like Walter Cronkite. I was there before you knew where Cape Canaveral was, before it was named Cape Kennedy or renamed Cape Canaveral. And I failed, and they sent you there instead. But we've assembled some pictures from your career, which we find inspiring, both in how far America has come in space and how your hairstyle has changed. And we like to show them now. The real Jules Bergman, standing up, falling over.
You sure you were there first?
Now there you're beginning to develop the steely glint in the eye that counts. This is a commercial for U.S. Steel, I think, these days. The hair is growing a little on top, but not on the sideburns yet. John Glenn. Alan Shepard.
They had less hair.
Virgil Grissom. And this is when you were beginning to take some of the tests, wasn't it?
Early flying lesson day, track with Mr. Piper and his Cub. Those were some of the astronaut qualification tests.
What they used to call a gantry. They don't call them gantries anymore.
They're called mobile service structures. That's the escape slide that never had to be used, fortunately. But we tested it. And then flying weightlessly inside the Air Force's...
I did that before you did, too. It's great fun.
Have you come down yet?
Yes,
Yes, it does marvels for lunch, breakfast, or other meals.
Actually,
That was actually the Banana River, and practicing egress training with the astronauts, I got stung by a giant jellyfish, or so the publicity said. It hurt a lot, at any rate.
You know, it's just looking at those stills remind you of how far we've come since 1958 in space. And I think that everybody's had kind of the feeling this year, assuming the final Skylab works out all right, is the fun all over? Is the romance gone?
A lot of the romance, most of the romance is gone. It's much more perfunctory, much more businesslike, Harry. The individual capers that took place in those days don't anymore because there's much tighter discipline. For example, some of the things that took place, we've never had a chance to talk about them before. I can recall one day in 1962, before Wally Schirra's first Mercury flight, 36 hours before the flight, we were holding a party at a friend's house in the Banana River. And Wally decided to go water skiing behind some horrendous high-powered boat, came blasting down the river at about 60 miles an hour, waving gaily, hit a mud flat, somersaulted into the air into what looked like the trees of an island. I said, oh my God, that's the end. He's dead, you know. 30 seconds later, he came out from behind the island smiling. He'd landed in the water on the other side uninjured. And there were senior NASA people at the party. The discipline was tightened up a little bit after that. Even prior to that incident, though, before Scott Carpenter's one and only flight, our second orbital flight after John Glenn's first, Carpenter had stayed up late the night before it. It was loosely described as a farewell party, and the discipline was quite loose in the crew quarters. Took off, so it is said, on 1 or 2 hours sleep, and toward the end of the 3 orbits over Hawaii, when the astronauts had to manually press the retro-fire button to fire the retro rockets to start the landing, Carpenter, so the story goes, was still waltzing around taking pictures inside the spacecraft and forgot to press the button. He was abruptly reminded with a lot of 4-letter words by a fine pilot named Al Shepard, but he still pressed the button 5 seconds late, overshot the landing mark in the Caribbean by 250 miles, and as you recall, while the Navy looked for him all afternoon, we all ad-libbed on the air for 3 or 4 hours. Like I said, that was Carpenter's only flight, because a good friend of ours named Chris Kraft, when he got the full report from his crew, looked up and said, that so-and-so will never fly again. And he never did. Never did.
Well, I remember in an early interview about the time you were taking those tests with the psychiatrist who helped pick the original 7 astronauts. And I said, would Christopher Columbus have made this group? And he says, of course not. He's entirely un-team-oriented. You know, he couldn't work. No way. And apparently it's gotten even worse now. I mean, much more organized.
Right, and it's terribly organized. What's more, the public has become used to it. Space was the great goal of the last decade. Energy has to be the great goal of this decade. But I can recall from those early days, you know, horrendous failures we had. Many unmanned flights that the public never got a chance to see. They were then secret military rockets, Atlases, Titans, and Thors, Minutemen. I think we have some film of that ready now.
I think we used to have to peek at those. Nobody would tell us when they were going to fail.
The great market in long-range field classes. There's an early Atlas that started off a pad, tilted over, hit the floor.
I first spent some time with ABC correspondent Charles Murphy when we were both at the White House. We have mutually agreed tonight that I will not discuss President Johnson's distaste for Mr. Murphy's cigar smoking habit, and he will not discuss the alleged time when I went to sleep in the White House press room. Is that fair, Charles?
I think, Nora, let me add, I won't tell him about the time that Lyndon Johnson turned on an electric pepper shaker grinder and you laughed.
No,
and he didn't.
No, he didn't laugh. I remember that. I stopped laughing.
Quickly. Very quickly,
I said before in the general introduction, I think that you and I have been generalists and have chased around a good deal as opposed to owning space like Jules does or even owning the White House for all that long a time. We've moved around. And sometimes people think that's the easy way to do it. But there are hazards in this particular kind of general assignment work that you wouldn't believe, and you've got an example of one.
Well, I travel quite a bit, and when I'm not traveling, I live in Miami, and whenever there's an alligator story, for some reason, I'm the one who's always called on. I don't know what it was like where you grew up in Nebraska, but when I was growing up in Oklahoma and later living in Texas, the mark of a man who had made it was a man who wore alligator shoes, skin shoes they call them down in the Southwest. But a man who helped make these things unstylish, purses too, was Walter Hickel, who was Interior Secretary under Mr. Nixon early on, before he left after writing a letter that Mr. Nixon didn't like. And he made a trip to Florida in about 70, I believe, or 69, to try to save the alligator from near extinction. The alligator was listed as an endangered species at the time, and he came down to fan up some publicity for the sake of the alligator. No one else would. But he was part of the ecological system of Florida and the other southern states, and he was a necessary element in it. And I went out to cover him. Well, sometime after that, I got a call from New York saying that they had read about a man in central Florida who had an alligator breeding farm. He had raised several thousand alligators, and he was stuck with them. He couldn't do anything with them because it was against the law to send them across state lines, alive or dead. And we have some film of this gentleman. I don't recall his name, but I remember being a little distressed when I was sent up there, thinking there wasn't much of a story there, but being greatly impressed by the number. This is the world's largest alligator farm, and that's the problem.
Come on now, back up. This, who sold it is beastly, old man. Lay down now. Lay down.
What are you going to do now?
I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm just stuck. There's a lot of mouths to feed.
He had a lot of mouths to feed.
Well, after that episode, Walter Hickel was fired from the administration and thereby lost his boarding pass on the Titanic.
That's very well put.
And you moved on to the war in Chile? And,
I moved on to Chile, and the alligators have prospered. And I hope I never see another alligator.
Do you think the United States had anything to do with the overthrow of the Allende government in Chile? The question everyone asks.
It's a question everyone asks, Howard. I don't know. There's no proof of it, but the suspicion is very widespread that we might have had something to do with it. Certainly we had something to do with cutting off credits to Allende, which speeded his downfall. Whether we had anything to do actually in financing the two strikes, the copper strike at Teniente and the truck strike that precipitated the crisis that led to the coup d'etat, I don't know.
We may know that by the time we do this same kind of a broadcast next year. In the meantime, I'd like to thank Jules Bergman and Charles Murphy, and Howard and I will be back with a couple of final thoughts in a moment. Well, as I noted when we started, we did this first kind of broadcast about a year ago. And the good thing about it is that, well, I think you occasionally get some insights into the experience of the reporters who appear, as opposed to a more formal situation. You don't have to really tie yourself up to anything. And looking back on the last year, it's just as well. because last year, in kind of a year-end and year-beginning broadcast of this kind, I don't think anybody mentioned Watergate. There was a great deal of talk about the triumph of President Nixon with the largest majority an American president ever gotten in an election. There was some talk about the Middle East, but nobody anticipated a war. We didn't even anticipate the winner of the National League pennant last January. So, as a matter of fact, we didn't even talk about alligators. It's almost impossible to figure how this broadcast will look a year from now, since the one that we did before, if we ran it now, would look, I think, quite intelligent, but also in a way naive. And that's nice, to keep on looking naive from year to year, as long as we're here from year to year. And I hope we will be. Don't you, Howard?
I hope so. After this, you may not be, though, Harry. I've been going over the information I picked up in the year 1973 that is absolutely useless but impressive to me. And one item deals with a Russian team of correspondents who were sent to this country in the beginning of the age of détente and told to say something friendly about us. And they visited the fringes of American cities, which to many Americans are a blight, with their neon jungles and hamburger stands and filling stations. But the Russians wrote to Pravda, the one thing we could imitate here in the capitalist world is the fringes of American cities. They add a touch of gaiety to life we don't have in Moscow. They said they would like especially to commend the man they called the famous military figure, Colonel Sanders, for his thrice. I think the moral of that story is we should look to our blessings that what seem like warts to us are often beauty spots to others. With that unimportant thought, for my fellow correspondents and Harry Reasoner, this is Howard K. Smith. Good night.
Explore the inner workings of one of the world's busiest air transport facilities with Rod Serling on location at Los Angeles International Airport, Part 2 on ABC Wide World of Entertainment tomorrow night.
Steve Bell, Tom Gerald, Bill Siemens, Jules Berkman, and Charles Murphy. This has been a presentation of ABC News.